They called it the Auschwitz of the Balkans, and for good reason. The Nazis had strict rules for their camps, but Jasenovac broke them all. While Germany's SS perfected the cold mechanical killing of gas chambers, Croatia's Ustaše chose something far more disturbing: slaughter by knives, hammers, even bare fists. This was not industrial death. It was chaos, blood, and cruelty so extreme that even hardened SS officers feared what they saw. But the real nightmare had only just begun. Jasenovac was born in the spring of 1941, in the shadow of a new fascist state, and under the watchful eye of men who had no interest in mere governance. They wanted blood. When the Axis powers tore Yugoslavia apart, the independent state of Croatia was handed to the Ustaše, a movement already drunk on nationalist fervor and ancient ethnic hatred. This was their moment, and they would waste none of it. They didn't just want to remove Serbs, Jews, Roma, and political opponents from their new Croatia. They wanted to erase them entirely. And so, on the marshlands along the Sava River, they chose a place where water could carry away bodies, where isolation could hide screams, and where the earth itself could be turned into a grave. Here, they would build not a prison, not a military fort, but a slaughterhouse for human beings. The choice of Jasenovac was not accidental. The terrain was remote enough to cut it off from outside eyes, but close enough to rail lines for quick transport of captives. The river offered a natural disposal system for the dead, while the surrounding wetlands promised disease, insects, and unbearable living conditions. Nature itself would become a weapon. The camp was planned with one goal: not the orderly efficiency of Nazi gas chambers, but the creation of an environment where cruelty could be exercised without limit. The Ustaše believed that public executions and intimate murders would instill more terror than any hidden industrial killing could achieve. Every aspect of Jasenovac's location, layout, and operation was chosen to amplify fear before death. Construction began in the summer heat. Local villagers, conscripted under threat, hammered wood and nailed together barracks, while Ustaše guards paced with rifles. These buildings were not meant to last. They were meant to contain suffering long enough for the inmates to die. The camp was divided into multiple subcamps: one for men, one for women, one for children, and one purely for labor that would kill through exhaustion. The perimeter was strung with barbed wire, the towers staffed by guards already selected for their loyalty to the regime and their capacity for violence. There was no pretense of rehabilitation or work service, only the inevitability of death. The first prisoners arrived in cattle cars that stank of human waste and fear. They came from all walks of life: peasants dragged from their farms, merchants pulled from their shops, priests taken from their pulpits. Some were political dissidents, others merely guilty of being born the wrong ethnicity. They stepped out into the humid air of the Sava marshes to the sound of barking dogs and shouting guards. For many, this was their first glimpse of the men who would decide their fate. Ustaše officers in black uniforms, knives strapped to their wrists, their expressions not cold but eager. The arrival process was designed to crush hope instantly. There were no registration lines, no formal records for many of the newcomers. Instead, the guards separated families on the spot. Men to one side, women and children to another. Personal belongings were stripped away, piled high in growing mounds of watches, clothes, and wedding rings. Prisoners were beaten before they were even marched inside, forced to crawl in the mud as guards laughed and kicked them. Those who stumbled were killed where they fell. There was no mistaking the message. Survival was not expected. From there, the prisoners were herded into the crude wooden barracks, long, stinking rooms where hundreds would be packed together. The air was suffocating, heavy with the scent of sweat, rot, and hopelessness. Windows were few and small, the better to trap heat in the summer and cold in the winter. The floor was bare dirt, already churned to mud by the footsteps of the condemned. Guards would burst in without warning, dragging people away for interrogations that almost always ended in death. Even on that first day, it became clear that Jasenovac was not a place where the condemned simply awaited execution. It was a place where execution began the moment you entered the gates. The camp's first weeks set the tone for everything to come. Prisoners were forced to work on expanding their own prison, laying new barbed wire, building more barracks, and digging the first of the mass graves that would soon fill. Some were marched down to the Sava with sacks of lime, ordered to throw the powder over bloated corpses drifting in the current. Others were put to labor cutting reeds from the marsh, their bare feet sinking into muck where snakes slid past and mosquitoes swarmed in black clouds. Every task was designed to exhaust, degrade, and remind them that their labor served no purpose but to strengthen the walls of their own captivity. Jasenovac was not yet the vast, sprawling killing machine it would become, but its soul was already set in place. It was a creation born from hatred, designed with precision to destroy both the body and the mind. The first prisoners, those early arrivals, were the test subjects for a system that would grow more sadistic with each passing month. And for those who stepped off the cattle cars in those first days, the realization must have been immediate. There was no return from this place. But the real horror was just beginning to unfold. Now we enter the heart of darkness itself, the daily existence within Jasenovac's blood-soaked walls. However, calling it life is perhaps the cruelest joke of all, because reality here transcended every boundary of human suffering previously thought possible. A typical day in this hellscape would drive most people to madness just hearing about it. Nevertheless, prisoners were awakened before dawn, not by bells or whistles, but by the screams of those already being tortured to death. But the horror wasn't random. It was a carefully orchestrated symphony of suffering designed to break both body and soul. Unfortunately, even the strongest individuals rarely lasted more than a few weeks under these conditions. The guards inflicted such elaborate tortures because efficiency wasn't the goal, absolute dehumanization was. Nonetheless, the Ustaše believed their victims were subhuman creatures who deserved to suffer for the crime of their existence. Therefore, every moment of agony served their twisted ideology, proving their supposed superiority while satisfying their bloodthirsty appetites. However, this approach created a feedback loop where guards competed to devise ever more creative forms of brutality. They sustained such intensive torture while maintaining camp operations through diabolical efficiency. Unfortunately, the system used a rotation where different guards specialized in different forms of torture, ensuring fresh enthusiasm for inflicting maximum suffering. Nevertheless, prisoners were also forced to participate in torturing each other, creating a psychological hell where survival meant becoming complicit in unspeakable acts. The starvation alone would have killed most prisoners within weeks, but the Ustaše weren't content with simple death by hunger. However, they turned even feeding into an opportunity for sadistic games, throwing scraps of bread into human waste and forcing starving prisoners to retrieve them with their mouths. But perhaps most horrifying was how they used food as a weapon, forcing prisoners to watch their own children starve, while guards feasted mere feet away. Yet what you're about to witness will make everything you've heard seem almost merciful. Nevertheless, among the countless perpetrators of atrocities, two names stand out for their exceptional cruelty. Figures so monstrous that their very existence challenges our understanding of human nature. However, these weren't random psychopaths who stumbled into positions of power. They were calculating sadists who elevated murder to an art form. Miroslav Filipovich, known to prisoners as Brother Satan, became uniquely terrifying because of his background as a Catholic monk who transformed religious devotion into genocidal fury. But this wasn't a man who simply lost his way. He was a calculated killer who developed signature methods that haunted even hardened criminals. Unfortunately, his most infamous trademark was a specially modified farming knife that he wore like a glove, allowing him to slit throats with the casual ease of a handshake. Nevertheless, his daily ritual of stomping children to death each morning became legendary among guards, who were forced to participate or face their own execution. A man of God became such an incarnation of evil because Filipovich represented the most dangerous type of fanatic, one who convinced himself that mass murder was a holy crusade. Nonetheless, he justified every atrocity as serving God and Croatia, creating a psychological framework that allowed him to commit unspeakable acts without remorse. Therefore, his religious background didn't prevent his descent into barbarism. It provided the moral justification he needed to exceed even Nazi expectations for cruelty. But if Filipovich was the camp's high priest of death, then Vyacheslav Luburić was its architect of suffering. Luburić became particularly terrifying through his administrative brilliance combined with sadistic creativity. Unfortunately, while Filipovich focused on individual murders, Luburić designed systems of mass torture that maximized both suffering and efficiency. Nevertheless, he pioneered techniques that other Ustaše camps would later adopt, spreading his innovations in cruelty throughout the Croatian killing machine. These monsters operated within the camp hierarchy by creating a culture where extreme violence became normalized and even celebrated. But here's what makes your skin crawl. They held competitions to see who could kill the most prisoners in a single night, with winners receiving special recognition and privileges. Nonetheless, this gamification of genocide created peer pressure among guards to constantly escalate their brutality, turning the entire camp into a laboratory for exploring the limits of human cruelty. But when darkness came, the true horror began. Darkness fell over Jasenovac, and the real terror began. Guards didn't rest at night. They treated the camp like their personal playground. Prisoners called these hours the Devil's Shift. When the worst atrocities happened behind closed barracks doors, guards would drag inmates into makeshift arenas, forcing them to fight each other barehanded while officers placed bets on who would die first. Losers weren't just killed, they were mutilated as lessons for the living. The Croatian knot became infamous, a crude wire noose tightened gradually until it sliced through flesh and vertebrae. Guards perfected this method for maximum suffering, sometimes taking hours to decapitate a single victim. Others preferred burning prisoners with hot irons in patterns that mirrored Ustaše insignias. Vyacheslav Luburić, known for his music lessons, suspended prisoners from ceiling beams by their wrists, letting gravity slowly tear their shoulder sockets apart. Their screams echoed through the camp, what survivors called the nightly choir. Alcohol-fueled interrogations had no purpose beyond entertainment. Guards would invent reasons to torture, a blink interpreted as defiance, a whisper treated as plotting. Row after row of prisoners knelt in mud pits, while officers took turns kicking them into unconsciousness. Some victims were thrown into deep wells, left to drown slowly as guards dropped rocks on them. Unlike daytime killings, these weren't about efficiency. They were about stripping away any illusion that pain had limits. The psychological torment was just as calculated. Guards staged mock executions, firing blank rounds at prisoners' heads before laughing at their reactions. Others forced inmates to dig their own graves, then made them lie in the dirt pits for hours, only to fill them in the next day with different victims. Women endured systematic rape, often in front of their families. Those who resisted were hanged, naked from the camp's main gate as warnings. Yet, the worst moments came when the screaming stopped. When a victim's voice gave out from sheer exhaustion, guards would complain about the silence, then pick a new prisoner to sing for them. By dawn, survivors crawled back to barracks, knowing the night's horrors would be erased come daylight. The dead vanished into mass graves. The living prepared for another shift in the factories. If the last moments felt unbearable, what's coming will hunt you in ways you can't unsee. Now we descend into the absolute nadir of human depravity. The torture methods that made Jasenovac infamous, even among Nazi officials who had thought they'd seen everything. However, these revelations will forever change how you understand the capacity for evil that lurks within seemingly ordinary people. Jasenovac's torture methods distinguished themselves not just through their brutality, but through their deliberate design to maximize both physical agony and psychological trauma. Nevertheless, the Ustaše didn't simply want to kill their victims, they wanted to utterly destroy their humanity first. But the methods they developed were so horrific that even documenting them feels like participating in the evil itself. Unfortunately, these weren't random acts of violence, but carefully refined techniques passed down from guard to guard like some satanic tradition. The infamous throat-cutting competitions became legendary throughout the camp system, but the reality was far worse than even the most lurid descriptions suggest. However, guards would sharpen their curved knives to razor precision, then compete to see how cleanly they could decapitate prisoners with a single stroke. But here's the spine-chilling truth. they would often deliberately botch the job, leaving victims to suffer for hours with partially severed throats, while guards placed bets on how long they would survive. They developed such elaborate methods because the Ustaše psychology demanded personal involvement in every death. Nonetheless, they rejected impersonal methods like gas chambers, preferring intimate violence that allowed them to watch their victims' final moments. However, this wasn't just sadism. It was a twisted form of ritual purification, where guards believed they were personally cleansing Croatia of its enemies. But perhaps the most spine-chilling aspect was how they incorporated families into their torture schemes. Unfortunately, parents were forced to watch their children's execution, then choose which family member would die next. Nevertheless, those who refused to choose would watch as guards tortured their entire family simultaneously. However, those who complied discovered that their mercy only prolonged everyone's suffering, as guards would inevitably kill all family members anyway. The medical experiments conducted without anesthesia pushed the boundaries of human endurance to their absolute limits. The Ustaše justified these atrocities to themselves by convincing themselves that their victims weren't truly human, making any level of suffering acceptable. Nevertheless, they documented their research with scientific precision, creating records that would later horrify war crimes investigators. Yet even these unthinkable horrors pale in comparison to the camp's final chapter. If you've stayed with us this far, you understand why stories like this can't fade into silence. Help us keep history alive. Hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next chapter we uncover. Unfortunately, as Allied forces closed in and the Axis powers crumbled, the Ustaše faced their worst nightmare, the possibility that their crimes would be exposed to the world. However, their response wasn't to surrender or flee immediately, but to launch the most frantic cover-up operation in genocidal history. Nevertheless, their actions during these final months revealed the true scope of their crimes, while demonstrating that their capacity for evil knew no bounds. The Ustaše were driven to such desperate measures by the realization that Jasenovac contained evidence of atrocities so extensive that they would horrify even war-hardened investigators. But their initial attempts at concealment only made things worse. Mass grave sites were hastily excavated, with thousands of bodies exhumed and burned in crude crematoriums that worked around the clock. Nevertheless, the sheer volume of human remains overwhelmed their ability to destroy evidence, leaving partially burned corpses scattered throughout the complex. They didn't simply abandon the camp and flee like other war criminals, because the Ustaše leadership understood that Jasenovac represented something uniquely damning, proof that they had exceeded even Nazi standards for systematic brutality. Therefore, they believed that destroying the evidence was their only chance of avoiding complete annihilation when justice finally arrived. But their paranoia drove them to even greater extremes, executing prisoners who had witnessed their cover-up attempts to ensure absolute silence. They attempted to eliminate hundreds of thousands of victims from the historical record through methods as brutal as everything else they'd done. Unfortunately, remaining prisoners were forced to dig up mass graves with their bare hands, stack bodies like cordwood, and operate crematoriums until they collapsed from exhaustion. But perhaps most horrifying was how guards would execute prisoner work crews once each gravesite was cleaned, ensuring that no witnesses survived to testify about specific locations. However, their efforts to erase history were ultimately doomed by the sheer magnitude of their crimes. But as Soviet and Yugoslav partisan forces approached, the Ustaše made one final, desperate decision that would haunt the region for decades. They attempted to murder every remaining prisoner in a final orgy of violence that would eliminate all living witnesses. What crawled out of this darkness would strip away any doubt about the depth of human evil. The war ended, but justice never came for Jasenovac. While Nazi leaders stood under the lights of Nuremberg, the Ustaše's architects of slaughter vanished into the shadows. Commanders slipped down rat lines to Argentina, Spain, and the United States on Vatican-issued passports. Others didn't run at all. They simply shed their names, opened shops, and walked the same streets as the survivors they had once tormented. Only a handful, like Miroslav Filipović, the monk who boasted of sending 30,000 to heaven, ever faced a noose. Yugoslavia locked Jasenovac's archives, turning a crime scene into a political tool. Death counts shrank in textbooks, memorials were vandalized, and the Sava's blood-stained banks became picnic grounds. Even now, rain loosens bone fragments from the soil, tiny relics the living still argue over. The worst betrayal was not in courts, but in communities. Killers shook hands with widows they had made. Some married the daughters of their victims. Murder became a memory to be buried, not a sin to be faced. Yet one question haunts more than any other. How many killers died old men in warm beds, whispering to grandchildren that the camps were just a myth? Could the answer be hidden in a locked Zagreb warehouse, inside a single forbidden drawer? The 1991 discovery in Zagreb shattered decades of silence. Hidden in a locked archive were photographs taken not by investigators, but by Jasenovac's own guards, kept as personal trophies. These weren't cold, forensic records, they were souvenirs of murder. Prisoners were captured mid-execution, their faces contorted in agony, or kneeling at the edge of freshly dug graves.
This monster was holding the infant by its legs and swinging it and yelling to the parents, make him shut up. The parents are yelling and the daughters, our baby, don't hurt our baby. With a smirk on his face, you can see he was enjoying what he was doing. He smashes the baby's head into the doorpost, killing it instantly. It's the memories that won't leave me. I get nightmares seeing that screaming infant and that sudden silence. God.
In every frame, guards grinned, uniforms streaked with blood, posing with weapons like hunters beside their kill. The backgrounds made it worse. Women in summer dresses clutched handbags while men smoked, watching executions as if they were afternoon sports. A shopkeeper leaned lazily against a fence, boredom etched across his face while, feet away, someone was beaten to death. This wasn't just state murder, it was public entertainment.
Very places where the experiences took place. And what's more, we've been using new technology like 360 video so that we can capture them in the places with the whole surrounding on film. That means in future, not only will future generations be able to go on March of the Living and hear their stories in the very places they gave them, but young people all around the world will be able to experience those stories in virtual reality. Here's a short film that explains what we've been doing together.
I've been here 3 times. Each time it brings different memories. This place brings back some of the horrible memories that a person can experience. And it is also a place that we experience the life that we don't wish on anybody else.
Many images were staged, the dead arranged like props, tools laid neatly beside severed limbs. One notorious shot shows a teenage guard crouched beside a corpse, his knife displayed like a trophy. Most of these photos remain locked away, deemed too dangerous for public release. But their existence forces one unbearable truth into daylight. The killers didn't just commit their crimes, they celebrated them. And some of the smiling faces in those frames may still walk the same streets today. Now consider this, the photos we've seen might just be the tip of the iceberg. Imagine what hasn't been found yet. Jasenovac wasn't unique, it was a warning. What began as political rhetoric became systematic murder, then casual entertainment for killers. The camps industrialized violence, but the real horror lay in how easily ordinary people joined in. Neighbors became executioners, shopkeepers watched massacres like afternoon shows. Today, the plaques and memorials can't fully capture the truth that genocide doesn't require monsters, just permission. The evidence remains in bone fragments, rediscovered photos, and survivor testimonies fading with time. But the legacy persists wherever groups are dehumanized for politics or power. So, we'll ask one last question. When you hear about cruelty today, do you recognize the pattern? The comment section is open.